This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, Spectra 1964, Atom Audio, Isotope, JZ Microphones, and Solid State Logic. You're hearing my voice right now on the JZ V12 microphone through the Spectra 1964 STX100D mic pre and C610 complementer with Isotope, RX, Ozone, and Neutron, all recorded safely onto an OWC SSD and mixed on Atom Audio monitors. So please remember to check out our awesome sponsors using the link in the show notes below. It's a great way to help support this show. And now, get ready to rock.
I always have clients over when I do mastering, for instance, and they're surprised that mastering has so much to do with getting the music to move in the right way. But that is very much connected to having good low end. And if you get the low end to work well, and to be evenly balanced, then it improves musical movement quite a lot. And people are surprised, like, wow, it starts to groove now.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Are you recording your own music or other people's music in your studio, but you're having trouble figuring out how to get your mixes to sound great? Do they sound weak and distant or lack punch and clarity? Well, I've got a gift to help you take your mixes from sounding like basement demos to sounding like professional mixes. And it's my free course called Mix Master Bundle. This course will show you how to get pro-sounding mixes from your home studio with free and stock plugins in Pro Tools. And the best part is that these mixing techniques will work for you in any DAW, whether you're in Logic, Cubase, PreSonus Studio One Reaper, or whatever you're using. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, and you can find the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. The JZ Microphone Vintage series are built by hand in Latvia, featuring the patented golden drop capsule design for enhanced clarity that will give your recordings that classic vintage tone. You're hearing my voice right now on the JZ V12 mic. Our friends at JZ Microphones have come up with a special offer only available to Recording Studio Rockstars listeners, so use the limited time coupon ROCKSTAR to get 40% off the V67, V47, and V12 microphones. Go to jzmic.com and get your vintage mic now. Howdy, Rockstars. It's your host, Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Wessel Oltheten, a mixing and mastering engineer in the Netherlands, who's been on the podcast on episode RSR392 to talk about his mixing studio, his mastering setup, his philosophies around all that. He is also a published author of the book Mixing with Impact on Focal Press, and teaches at Utrecht University of the Arts. Wessel is very prolific, and in 2021 was able to work on no less than 862 tracks. That's a lot of music all in 1 year, dude. His discography sounds really great, working with very cool bands like Dewolff, Pocket Knife Army, Black Oak, and many others. Whether it's independent art rock, electronic music, or singers up close and personal, Wessel has the ability to make it sound really great with his thoughtful mixing and mastering, and we are excited to have you back on the show. Please welcome Wessel Oltheten to Recording Studio Rockstars again. Wessel, are you ready to rock, dude?
Of course I am, Lich. Thank you for your wonderful introduction.
You're welcome, dude. It's great to have you back.
I'm flattered.
Tell us a little bit about, it's been a few years at least since you were on the show before. What's changed in your studio? You're joining us from your control room now, and I can see it on the video. It looks gorgeous. There's like these big panels up behind you on the ceiling that just have different size holes drilled in it. It looks like your studio looks like an art project.
Well, it is a 20-year ongoing DIY effort. And yeah, one step at a time. And I think that will be familiar to many of the rock stars out there that, well, you start small and then you go from there. And I think that's actually a nice way of working. You know, I never really robbed the bank to be able to buy all this stuff in all at once. And then you sort of grow out of certain things and certain equipment, and you know what you want to get next. And I think that sort of makes sense to go gradually and expand from there.
Yeah. It's funny, even as we get started here, I was thinking about how good your discography sounds. It's just very high fidelity. Your approach to music is very high fidelity, where I find that the music seems to speak the way it's meant to speak, but it's also very clear. And it sounds like just sounds high fidelity at the same time. There's nothing harsh in there, and your voice sounds that way right now, even on this interview. So tell us what you're interviewing with here, because I know this is the one podcast where you get to talk about what mic you're using.
Yeah. This is Microtech FL, the Eastern German company, sister company of Neumann. And this is a M930, which is a solid state large diaphragm microphone. And it's just, clear and doesn't really have that much sound of itself.
Yeah, it's definitely very clear. What about the mic preamp and stuff like that? Anything special there?
Well, I have had to dust off my old Crane Song Spider. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's an 8-channel mic pre. I used to do a lot of location recording, orchestras and stuff like that, opera even. And I took these racks of pre's with me, but now I'm only mixing and mastering these days. But I never really got around to selling the Crane Song. I love the thing so much that I think, okay, it's barely getting any use except for your podcast now. But still, it serves me well.
We're fancy. We deserve the very best.
Yeah.
And is it so it's a standalone 8-channel mic pre where you'd use an XLR in and then an XLR out, or is it an interface for the computer?
It also has a AD converter, 8-channel. And I know over the years, Dave Hill has improved the design a couple of times. So I wouldn't say like the A to D converter I have is like top notch now. I think that technology is moving fast, I remember back in the day when I reviewed a lot of equipment for audio magazines, then you got all these different converters and it made such a world of difference. And now I'm surrounded by a couple of very nice converters and I'd say it's all very nuanced, the differences between them.
And is that just a USB into a computer or something like that?
Well, the Crane Song actually only had EBU and ADAT out. So you'd still have to run another interface. Yeah. But nowadays, my whole studio has been connected with MADI.
Okay.
And RME MADI PCI card. And that just works great. It's rock solid. And I even moved to the M1, the newer Mac system. I came from PCs originally. I used to build PCs myself. And they served me well, but now the M1 it's a nice package, very quiet, fast, and the PCI card works great in just an external chassis.
What tempted you to move over from a PC to the M1?
Compatibility. I always had a Mac laptop, and it became an appealing thought that if one computer broke down, then theoretically I could plug in just the USB 3 cable in my laptop and run the entire studio from there. And also it became a bit like you get to know one system and the shortcuts and the workflow, and then it made sense to have the similar system in the studio.
So I've never used MADI. I've heard about it. How do you describe the connectors? How are they different from USB connectors or Thunderbolt or,
Well,
USB-C?
you have two formats, an optical format and a copper format. And the copper is just coax cable with the BNC connector.
Just like a cable television
Yeah,
connector or
exactly
like a
like
clock?
that. Yeah, like a word clock cable, exactly like that. And the optical is a dual cable, so send and return. And you can send 64 channels and return 64 channels over one of these dual cables at low sample rates, so up until 48 kilohertz. And then if you work at higher sample rates, you can have the amount of channels. So you end up at 32 channels back and forth. And then the RME box can handle 3 of those back and forth connections simultaneously. So it's an immense amount of channels. And actually, it sort of convinced me to get rid of all my patch bays. So I now have like a converter for each rack of equipment.
I was going to joke, of course you need like a bazillion inputs if you're mixing and mastering, but you do, because if you're using external hardware, then you do need lots of stuff coming and going, right?
Yeah. To be honest, I'm not sure whether I would buy the same stuff if I were to start over now. But, I started out 20 years ago and I bought all this equipment because it sounded way superior to what computers were doing in those days. And now I have all the stuff and I'm sort of grown accustomed to it and it sounds nice. It still sounds nice. So I just wired everything up, but it became clear for me, like you have to find an efficient workflow for that to still be able to maintain that type of equipment in this century.
So you're saying if you were less efficient, you might have only mixed 861 tracks.
Yeah. Well, that track count is mainly due to my mastering work. I think that's one of the things that has changed since the last time we spoke. I'm just getting more requests for doing mastering. And they're nice projects, so I'm not saying no. And then you end up with a lot of music in a year. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, tell us more about your studio now. When you look around, what do you see around you? Just describe it to the rock stars.
Well, conceptually, it's like my main desk where I spend the most of the time. I have a 16-channel fader controller, the Avid S3, and this is as a replacement for an old controller I was very fond of, but that was the Smart AV Tango, and I really enjoyed that system, and I was kind of scared to move over to another system because it wasn't supported anymore. The company went bankrupt and stuff like that, so you know how it goes. I'm now using the Avid one, but it serves me very well actually. So I'm quite happy with the move, and I'm quite fast with it, and it just is exactly what I want. Just a couple of faders or enough faders, clear displays, a bit of color coding to help you navigate a bit quicker. And I'm still doing a lot of manual fader rides and comparing A/B-ing channels when doing mastering, and then that's just my main controller. I'm really trying to leave the computer screen out of it, so the computer sits behind me on a mobile station. I do editing there.
What operating system are you on right now with your M1?
I wouldn't be able to tell you, Lidge.
Okay.
Yeah,
you're advanced. You're in the secret society.
If it works, I just don't know. If it works,
okay.
It works. Yeah, it's.
Do you feel like you upgrade to the newest thing, or do you always try and be very slow about upgrading because you've got something that works?
I'm careful with upgrading, so it's probably an older version. And then every once in a while, when I have a bit of time to spare, which is not often, then I do updates. And every time you change something to a computer system, you need a day to get everything back to being reliable, and that's even optimistic, right?
Yeah, a day is generous. Yeah. So your strategy is maybe every 1,000 songs you might update something.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I update very little actually. And it also, the thing is, I don't use much plugins. So that makes it quite easy. So if my DAW runs, then everything else is fine. And that's also great for like backward compatibility with all projects. You know, the DAW stays compatible pretty well with opening old projects, but the old plugins, you know, they're usually abandoned after 10 years or so. So I've had requests of doing like instrumentals or different edits of songs done like 15 years ago. And because I've always worked this way, I'm used to recording stems and recording all the analog processing and just saving it for later. And then sure, subtle stuff may have changed. You know, I'm using a different summing system, or there's little things that color the sound in a particular way, but I'm just listening and thinking, oh yeah, well, it should sound a bit like this, and I'll recreate it on my new system. But then you can have the same sound going pretty easily, actually. It's a bit like what you see on the. Do you watch the classic tracks documentaries that the BBC did on or classic albums? You know,
Yeah.
where they pull up old multi-tracks and you see somebody at a desk and let's see what's here, and all the faders are at zero, and it actually sounds pretty much like what they had.
Yeah.
I think it's a similar approach. You get the sound, you commit, record it on a track, and save the multi-track for later.
Yeah, I love watching those documentaries. They're great. I think two of my favorite were the making of Dark Side of the Moon, which was really fun to see. And then the Frank Zappa's Apostrophe.
That
was another fun one.
Wow. Yeah, I just read Frank Zappa's autobiography. It's, a great laugh.
If that's the same one that came out after, before he died or whatever it was, I remember reading that too. Was that the one where he talked about he thinks of cigarettes as food? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, it sounds familiar. Yeah, what I remembered is he started out with, okay, my editor wants an inspirational quote from some kind of philosopher to go here, because that's what they do in books. And then, that was the tone of voice. That's
great. Well, you can use that tone of voice for this next question. Wessel, you've been on the show before, but I'll ask you again in case I didn't ask you last time. We like to have our guests share an inspirational quote to kick off the podcast. Is there anything that comes to mind for you or anybody that particularly inspires you in music?
I thought about this, and you know what changed the most for me since the last time we met is I had 2 children, and that
you didn't after one you didn't get the.
No,
figure it out.
I'm a bit thick-headed like that, you know. So it took 2 to get the message. But we
love you, kids. If you're listening, we love you.
They change your life completely, you know.
Yeah.
And for the better. But it also affects, your professional life. And I think everybody involved in music recognizes that it's not just something you do for a living. It's also something you need to do because it's in your system and you need to get it out. You need to create beautiful things. And if there's no boundaries, it's quite easy just to always be in the studio or always like do this final tweak or always improve the stuff that you've already worked on. So it never ends. And I've actually learned, and that would be my inspirational quote, that you can also have too much free time. And I think it actually made my studio time way more into a sacred moment. Like there is peace and quiet. I go in early in the morning. I'm a morning person, so that works for me. But then I'm just surrounded by quiet and music coming out of the speakers if I choose to. And it just also feels great to have a bit of pressure. And what changed for me is I started to work quicker. and I started. This it's a long build up towards the clue, but I had this student, and he handed in like mixing assignments, and I listened to them, and I judged them like, okay, where are you at now? And I said, well, I think they're actually very much on point, just a bit rough around the edges, so you can improve a bit there and there and there. But he got like a higher grade than some of his classmates who spent a lot of time on it, and he was confused. And he came to me after class, and he said, like, yeah, Wessel, I did this stuff in less than half an hour per track. How is it possible that I get a better grade than somebody who spent like 4 hours on a mix? And I said, okay, I was surprised. I said, I didn't know you did it that quick, but you got the main things in place. You got like the important stuff right. And that's half the battle, you know? And yeah, well, that got me thinking. And then also with the pressure of having confined days to work in, I have to leave at 5 to pick up the kids. I started working a lot faster myself, actually, and I think it works well. I'm not getting any complaints, you know. And also, there's less time for doubt.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just finish sometimes a lot of stuff in one day, and I'll do reviews, you know, for like bigger albums. I work on for a full day on an album, but I always get something done so people can listen to the full album at home. And I'll do the same. And then we'll get back to doing revisions. But you'll be surprised how little revisions there actually are. So quite often, the first impression and the first intuition of how to go about it is actually right. And I think what also is starting to pay off is that I'm in this room for such a long time, and that I know the speakers through and through, and that everything is just like, I'm in my comfort zone. I couldn't do this in another place. So if I were to switch studios, I would be much more insecure. But nowadays, it just, it's dependable.
Yeah. Atom Audio introduces the all-new A7V monitor with rotatable HPS waveguide for the accelerated ribbon tweeter and advanced onboard DSP-based room correction using the included A-Control software or optional SonarWorks software with a measurement mic, allowing you to tune your speakers for your room, your mix position, and your ears anytime you want. Get the extended 5-year warranty for monitors that will improve as your studio improves at atomaudio.com. It's amazing that we can create professional mixes using a computer in our home studios, but trying to mix with a mouse, it's like trying to play the guitar with the tip of a pencil. It sucks. And why shouldn't you be able to mix as naturally as you play the guitar? That's why I upgraded my studio to include the SSL UF8 fader pack and UC1 channel strip controllers. They let me mix as fast as I can feel the music. Go put the fun back into your mixes at solidstatelogic.com. Now, if I recall correctly, you had some sort of passive subwoofers or something like that in your studio as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I had. They're not actually passive, but I have low frequency absorbers made by.
Oh, right, active low frequency absorbers. That's what it is.
By PSI Audio, the AVAA systems.
And those just live in the corners or something like that?
Yeah. They, you know, what the human mind has the most trouble with is short reflections. You can't separate those from the source material, you know? And so you can just use your eyes, basically, to determine what you need to do to a room to make the speakers perform better. And one way is to just incorporate the boundaries in the system. So you build the speakers into a wall, and there the reflection is in time and in phase, and you remove the coloration that way, soffit mounting. But another way is to try and absorb as much as possible from these nearby surfaces. Now, I have my subs, they're mounted vertically on the floor. There's a stereo subwoofer system. So the floor is in phase. They're basically soffit mounted on the floor, you could say.
Wow.
So that reflection is gone. That already makes a great difference in how solid the low end is. And also the fact that you use stereo subwoofers. Because, if you drive a room from multiple places, statistically, it evens out. One place is always going to be a crooked response, but two places is two crooked responses. But when you combine them, they're actually less crooked,
So
or you have to have very much bad luck.
Two bad guys makes a good guy.
Yeah, sort of.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and it's the same with microphones if you use them in spaces, right? So try to record a drum kit with just one microphone and you'll notice how difficult it is. And you can find a spot where everything balances out, but then there's still the acoustics and there's always a signature there. And if you use two microphones, just space them out, even if you're not doing stereo, but you do it quite randomly, just combine two zones and avoid any too much crosstalk and comb filtering and correlation between mics, yada, yada, yada. But then you get a nicer average of the actual room sound. And it's the same with speaker systems. If you have two systems and especially stereo subwoofers, you can have more even sounding low end. And then, to finish this story, the active absorption system is positioned at the nearby walls. So actually the corners behind the speakers. And it seems like the walls just seem to move further from the speaker if you turn it on. So it removes that low coloration added. So boundary interference.
And they're in the corner, they're in the bottom corner of the room, or they're up high, but in the corner?
Yeah, in the bottom. So the subwoofer is also on the floor. So the bottom corner is the place where the speaker introduces the most energy in the room. So there the reflection is also giving back the most energy. So that's the place where you end up with this, or that's the cause of the strongest interference that you will end up with.
Yeah.
So that's where you place the absorbers. If I were to go the traditional route, you'd use porous absorption materials like rock wool or mineral wool. But you'd need I don't know how many feet, but lots of it. And this is just performing it can dampen down 40 hertz resonances. And since I got that system in place, my life became so much easier. You'd be surprised in mastering how much an even low end makes a difference, even for music where you would think that there's not much happening in the low end. But you can hear the effects of low frequency cutoffs shrink the entire sound image up until much higher frequencies than where the actual filter is positioned, for instance. And things like double bass, it's almost impossible to record that instrument in a smaller studio. And I do a lot of acoustic records, jazz records also. And you can't blame a recording engineer. It's just impossible to record that instrument with the even sounding response. But you'd be amazed if you actually hear what is down there and you can correct it with nice EQ and even it out, how much difference that makes for how stable the sound image is and how comfortable everything else can sit. So it all starts to sound less confined. Even when those actual low notes aren't being played, you still hear the effects of the coloration of the recording room.
Yeah, and Rockstars, when he says double bass, he's not talking about a high-speed kick drum in a metal record. Although that has its own challenges. But yeah, an upright bass is one of the hardest things to record. It's hard to figure out where to put the mics. It's hard to even just figure out where to put it with a band in a room, because I find that it often needs a really big open gain on the microphone if you want a full natural sound. And then it's but if you do that and there's any other instrument in the nearby, it's almost funny to me. Sometimes I think Like, who came up with the idea for upright bass in a jazz band? It's like you can't even hear the thing, and it's right next. Maybe with a great player, you do hear it.
Yeah, but it's surprisingly soft for such a big instrument.
Oh my gosh!
But it all has to do with like physics. The difficulty is like getting enough air to move at low frequencies, and lots of instruments struggle with that. An acoustic guitar, they built a resonance chamber in there just to support like 100 hertz as an EQ effect, actually. And of course, the double bass also has that, but it goes down so low that it's just difficult to produce like serious sound output. And they sound great if you hear them in a concert hall. The acoustics can really support the instrument, and you don't have any room modes like taking out certain notes, and so
there's more than just one.
yeah, yeah. I did a recording where they had 8 in the orchestra. Well, that's nice, and they actually positioned them in stereo, so like not the traditional setting of double basses on the right, but just like 4 on the left, 4 on the right, really full low end. But in a smaller studio, it's impossible to place the microphone as far away as you would need to record the instrument evenly, because at that distance it's just too soft, and the reflections are taking over, and spillage from other instruments is taking over. So it's just impossible. So then you end up with having to combine like 2 microphones or something like that, more up close, and trying to get an even image of all these complex resonances happening in the top plate of the instrument. And I've seen like diagrams and high-speed camera footage of how these things resonate. But once you've seen that, it becomes immediately clear why it's just impossible to capture an even bass sound at a close distance.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I remember doing a session with a full jazz ensemble in my studio. And 2 things. One is I was amazed at how I was able to put everybody in the same space. I think maybe the drummer decided to put on headphones just for a little bit extra detail, but otherwise, nobody needed headphones. They were all on top of each other. And like you said, just having that many microphones in the same space just kind of remarkably worked, where I would have thought like, oh, you can't put a saxophone right next to the drummer, right next to the piano and everything. But most of it worked, except for the one thing, the bass. I just could not. I was taking microphones and sticking it 1 inch from the bass, and I'm like, I still can't hear the bass. All I hear is everybody else, So in the end, we had to rely on the DI going out into an amp in the other room, and then I mic'd the amp, and I just figured out some way. I had to do a combination of like a solid state amp and a different cabinet that I had until I finally had a combination that sounded clean and sounded good, and then I just mic'd that.
Yeah. And you'd be surprised at how many modern jazz records are just recorded in one go, but in booths with every instrument separated.
Right. Yeah.
It's just a very difficult thing to get right, I really like that One Mic YouTube channel that John Cuny-Birdie has. He's been a guest here, right? And well, since then I've checked it out, and I'm trying to recreate it with my students. So it's basically a Bloomline setup, and then you record a band in one room. Man, it becomes so obvious what every musician is contributing or what they're lacking, and how difficult this actually is, that it only, like, I admire the guy only more now, but it's just very difficult to get right. And I also think to some extent it works, but not for all types of music, And then it becomes like, okay, is it the holy grail to record everything in one room together? I personally don't think it is. I think some bands really want that because they read it in interviews, and they've seen other people like sort of brag about, yeah, we recorded it all in one go with spillage and everything, and then only overdub vocals or straight to tape and all that type of stuff. And yeah, but if you're making other music, or if you're not used to creating that acoustic sound together, it becomes a very painful and just a difficult process. and it actually gets you further from the outcome you would, or your audience would find convincing, and then what is natural? I don't know.
Right. Well, I think there's different styles of music doing different things. I've been listening to Django Reinhardt a lot lately, and I know he recorded through different decades, but I believe he did. But, I think of the iconic recordings of those guys in the Hot Club jazz sound of Paris. And I would love to know how they recorded. I assume it's all at the same time. And I assume they didn't have a ton of mics going. But man, when I listen to it, I'm like, it just sounds perfect,
Yeah.
It's just so great.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they recorded those either, but
probably not just one mic, but maybe.
Yeah, but at least it's a simple setup, and I think that makes a whole lot of sense, because I think like the main challenge also in getting any mix to work is to like mitigate all the conflicts. Like every microphone you add is like a new camera viewpoint, So if you use a lot of microphones, it's actually like a multicam production with a lot of various viewpoints. But in music, we're trying to create like one image where everything has its place, and sure, things can change, but not too much, because then the entire image changes so much that you actually put off the listener. And then they would need a new introduction, like, oh, okay, this is the new world I'm engaged in. And so there is actually much less freedom than you would think. You would think, okay, I want to do this, add a microphone, add this element in the mix, but then that element changes everything, changes perspective, it pushes all the other stuff to the background, and the funny thing is that can be a very little element causing all that havoc. I have the greatest of battles with small metal percussion and like sharp transient tambourines or things with really short snappy transients.
Yeah.
You add one of these sounds in a mix, and the brain just thinks, okay, there is the foreground, and then everything is related to one another, so everything else moves to the back. And this isn't like masking, where everybody is concerned with, okay, one frequency dominates another frequency and now I can't hear it. You can still hear everything. It's just not
perception.
music. It's just not music anymore, because it's now separated out. You have this layer of very bright frequency content with very sharp transients.
Yeah.
And it just occupies all your attention on some layer right in front of you, and you barely notice anymore what's going on in the back. You can still hear it,
and it's probably recorded wrong anyway. If you've ever listened to my interviews with Bill Cheney, and he talks about the difficulties of recording percussive metallic transients, the test that they do to test out a microphone and preamp is to just jingle keys, keys right next to the microphone. But by the way, it's okay for you to talk trash about the tambourine, but don't say anything bad about the cowbell, okay?
I won't.
Okay, good. Yeah, we all know why. We all know why, rock stars.
Yeah.
Okay, so the one mic thing, when I think about that too, I think about a couple of things. One is you make a good point, which is you can't try and force the music to fit something that it's not. And as far as a recording and production and mixing style. And I think we've all done that. I've done that. I went to recording school and I went back to my band and I was like, we need to get the ring out of the snare drum before we can even start recording. And then, 5 hours later and we're messing with the snare drum. It didn't even matter, in the end. So there are times where, we reference a particular style of music that's totally inappropriate for the music that we're creating in that moment. That can be challenging. But on the other hand, I do think that creating boundaries for ourselves in the studio can become artistic frameworks within which to create. So the one mic thing, for example, if you're not pushing it too far, can be a brilliant way to figure out how to get a particular sound, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it automatically leads to a particular character, and it automatically makes choices for you. And well, there's lots of these challenges that an artist can lay upon themselves, to get somewhere. I mixed this recording by Dewolff that they recorded to 4-track cassette tape in a tour bus, and it actually is released on vinyl and became one of their full-length records. But it was like a challenging thing. But these things, they work. They automatically lead to a result that is different. And I think the one mic thing, it intrigues me so much because I actually like the results so much that this is actually what I'm trying to create when mixing or recording other projects that don't lend themselves as well to that particular method. So if you were to record a metal band, for instance, it will never work with that particular...
Hold up. John Cuniberti, if you're listening to this podcast right now, that's a challenge. We just threw down the gauntlet. We want to hear you too.
I'd love to hear it.
A metal band on the one mic.
A metal band on the one mic. But you know what? His result is a sound image without conflict. So everything has its place and there are no conflicting cues in there. So you can hear where all the sounds are coming from, and the entire story that they're projecting just makes sense. And that's the type of world that you want to create with any mix. And it doesn't always need to be like that particular room and a natural scenario. So if I wanted to create like Star Wars sound, like a sound in space, I'd still somehow need to position everything so that it together takes on the meaning of sound in space, and
of which there is none.
Yeah, of which there is none. So you get these reverbs without audible reflections in them, and I call those the reverbs without boundaries.
Yeah, great.
And it's gone. But the thing is, you have to be consistent with your mixing decisions to get the sound image to be as lifelike and as clear as what he is getting with the one mic solution always. Like it's challenging to get it to work in terms of balance and reflections versus direct sound and getting a performance of all these wonderful musicians all at once and committing to that take. That's challenging. But then his mix and the sound image is not, it's just working beautifully because it's so beautifully simple.
If you've ever wondered how I get a consistent sound quality mixing hundreds of episodes of Recording Studio Rockstars, it's because I've been cheating by using Isotope RX, Ozone, and Neutron on every single episode. Right now, you're hearing on my voice RX breath control, D-click, D-clip, DS, Deplosive, voice denoise, Ozone multiband compression, Neutron EQ, and limiting, all from Isotope. Check out the subscription option with an extended 30-day free trial at isotope.com/rockstars, or use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off any individual plugin purchase. No matter where you like to rock in the galaxy, the OWC Envoy Pro Electron lets you record up to 2 terabytes over USB-C with speeds of up to more than a gigabyte per second, transfer your tracks in a flash, and take your samples and sessions with you to the studio or stage. The OWC Envoy Pro Electron is your waterproof, dustproof, and crush-proof SSD that you can rely on. Use our custom link in the show notes to help support this podcast at macsales.com/rockstars. You know, it was many years ago. It was right when I moved to Nashville, and I was collecting CDs that I really liked the sound of. And one of them, I wish I could remember the name of the artist, but it was a record recorded by a jazz quartet in a big wide open space, kind of like RCA Studio I think it is, Ben Fold's studio here in Nashville, which is a really big space, big wide open space where you don't really hear the reflections. It's very diffuse. And they did it with a Blumline mic technique. So it was each instrument was just in one of the quadrants. And I remember it sounding really great, you know, but it is different. It's different from having a tube mic right up on the sax that's up close where you get that big proximity effect and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's very much different. And, you know, the Blumline, I can talk for quite a bit about the Blumline setup because it's been invented so long ago, you know, I think now probably over a century ago. And it does so many things right for stereo, like you wouldn't believe it. You know, what is difficult in stereo is to use phase differences between the speakers to get depth. And, you know, it is a popular method in recording classical music to use A-B setups and have these time issues or time differences between the microphones, and you get some sort of pseudo three-dimensional sound because we're used to hearing phase differences. But then when you hear it outside of the sweet spot or you hear it in mono, it doesn't really translate all that well. Well, in classical music, they don't really care all that much about that. So they say, okay, our audience usually listens on nicer than average systems and in stereo. So we'll employ that technique. But if you look at Blumline, what it does is it actually uses only intensity differences between left and right channels to position the sounds. It's fully mono-compatible in that way, since it's two microphones placed at exactly the same spot. But the actual microphones you can use can sound more natural than cardioid microphones. So the figure of eights, they off axis, they just sound much more dead. So the null is much better, but also for every frequency. Like most cardioids are omnidirectional in the lows. So if you cross them and you create an XY setup, the lows are usually mono. And that creates a very small sounding sound image, you know?
And that should also create a buildup of lows too, if you sum to mono, right?
Yeah. So there is usually, well, a particular coloration in there that is just not very favorable. And, well, if you place cardioids a bit wider from one another, like you end up with ORTF or NOS setups, then they're easily separated because of the timing differences. And then that also works. But the beauty in Blumline is it still captures phase differences. Like, because the mics are crossed and the mics all have like positive polarities on the front and negative polarities on the back, if you have a reflection from the sidewall, it ends up positively on the left microphone and negatively on the right microphone. So you have the same reflection, but it's with opposite polarity in each sides of your mix because you pan the microphones hard left and right.
Yeah.
And so what Blumline does is like a razor sharp image of all the sources in front of the mics and also in the back of the mics.
Yeah.
And the reflections from the sides, they become extra wide with this weird phase effect. You know, you never get a 180-degree phase difference in real life, but our brains find it convincingly enough to say, okay, this is spacious sound. So now the reflections become spacious. And this is actually what you want from a stereo setup. You want razor sharp projection from the actual sound sources, and you want the reflections to be sparse because, you know, the space is limited in stereo, but the reflections that you do have, it's nice if they're like big. And now what happens if I press the mono downmix button? The reflections from the sides disappear, they cancel out, and you only remain with the sound sources and the reflections coming from the front and the back. And the actual setup is also not that sensitive on the top and the bottom. So ceiling and floor reflections are not captured that well with Blumline. And those are the reflections that we struggle with most to separate from the direct sound. So if you sum all this up, I don't think that Alan Blumlein ever thought of all of this when he invented the system, but it is part of the magic of why it works so wonderfully well in for recording stereo. And old ribbon mics or modern ribbon mics, they're not the most perfect microphones for every application, but there's a particular quality in there that you can really get if you're recording Blumlein.
Now, what about if you're recording Blumlein with condensers? Do you feel similarly, or do you feel like that's a different beast?
They're harder to make sound right. And I know a bit about microphone design, but not everything. So take this with a grain of salt. But the condensers have a harder time getting the low frequency response deep enough. And also because a condenser can't be a fully open diaphragm, there's always a backplate involved to get the electrical system to work. There is always a partly shielded off back end of the diaphragm. And so the condenser figure of eights tend to sound less good, I'd say, or less linear off axis, and have less low end extension. So you can get the newer ribbon microphones, I got these N8s by AEA, and they can just be fairly quiet actually for a ribbon microphone and record real low frequency sound pretty well. And so I'm not sure whether it's just impossible to create a condenser figure of eight that really sounds as extended as that, but I think it's pretty difficult. Otherwise, I would know of one.
Cool.
But please inform me if you do know one.
That was great. That was a great introduction to Blumlein and everything, and really explanation. So I do have one last question about it. When you, to your ear, when you've set it up and you're looking at a Blumlein, so in other words, one mic is kind of shooting off to your left a little bit, one mic is shooting off to your right, and let's say you're supposed to be the singer right in the center, singing right into them. Does it sound pinpoint clear on the singer's voice, or does it sound better if the singer sings right into one of those mics? Difficult question.
Difficult question, Lidge. Yeah. I'd say the best thing you can do is increase distance. Because, if the singer is up close, the Blumleins, they are so sharp in terms of polar pattern. It's the sharpest pattern, hypercardioid is about equally sharp as a figure of eight. And it means that if you move a bit to one side of the microphone, immediately
really
the level drops. And that's no problem in a properly set up Blumlein system, because it just moves to the other channel and they overlap. And so you get, but you get panning effect.
Yeah.
And that's pretty bothersome, I think
Stevie Wonder singing into this would be a little bit kind of cool, actually. He does his thing.
I think we would have to lock him down in some way.
No way, man. He's moving.
No. Yeah, then no, I wouldn't go for that approach. I'd say they're just one singer, one microphone, and automate the level, and even automate EQ to even out differences in sound color, and make it work.
Can you do an MS technique with a Blumlein as well, where can you do a figure eight as the mid and then the figure eight for the sides, or does the mid have to be a cardioid?
You have to have the same polarity to be able to do the mixing to different channels in MS. So MS works because you have a reference that picks up sound from everywhere with positive polarity, and then you have the bidirectional component, which has only got positive polarity on, let's say, the left side and negative on the right side. And then because you can combine those, you can sort of isolate these separate directions and also determine the width of the image by the gain relationship between the two. But you can have like multiple MS setups. That's what they actually are using in immersive audio quite a lot, and also have been using in surround sound quite a lot. Like Schoop's had this system, double MS, and then you create two back-to-back cardioids, which is pretty much like any Braunmühl-Weber capsule, like any Neumann U47 type of capsule with double membrane. They're actually back-to-back cardioids, and if you place like a figure of 8 over the capsule facing the sides, you can create an MS setup for the front and an MS setup from the back, just from these 3 signals. And if you expand on that, then you can get into ambisonics territory, and that's basically 3 figure of 8s for each axis in space, a figure of 8, and 1 omnidirectional microphone as a reference for decoding these signals.
Man, I might need to sit down for this one.
Yeah, but it's probably
it's really exciting though. It's cool.
It's a bit much. To be honest, you know, those setups are already more complicated, and I'm wondering whether it's needed actually.
I have not used an ambisonic mic yet, but I'm curious about them. I think it'd be fun to hear.
I've done a lot of testing with those as well, and they built them with cardioid capsules. So companies like Sennheiser and the Sound Field system, obviously.
Yeah,
and you know, the cardioid capsule also doesn't really have the quality that a nice omnidirectional microphone or a figure of 8 can have. Right. So it works, and you know, the spatial decoding you can get from it is actually great, but I'm usually inclined to think, okay, this is great if you do immersive sound experiences or sound for game or movies, but for music, I'm not really seeing that this is any way a superior type of microphone compared to what we already got.
Yeah, because we need an emotional element to the choice of mic in music.
You know, everybody is now totally focused on the spatiality of everything. So because of all the Dolby Atmos and immersive content being pushed, and in actual research done by I think Francis Rumsey of the AES, it came about that the listening panel actually values a great timbre of sound much more than correct spatial impressions. So and I think that's the emotional component that you talk about. We want to hear with crystal clear detail how a singer is performing, like every nook and cranny in their autonomy. You want to hear it working, and you want to be there. And that sense of being there, for me, has less to do with projecting this actual space that it took place in. No, it has more to do with capturing that source with great fidelity, and also placing it in a very refined mixture with the other sources. And that's the other thing that is a bit scary when you move to multi-channel immersive territory, that the mix becomes so... I'd say a danger of becoming off balance when you're not exactly in the sweet spot, or if you use a different binaural decoding solution, or if you, et cetera, et cetera. It's getting complicated. And I think the one thing I've learned in audio is make it as little complicated as possible, and it usually tends to sound better.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about timbre, because timbre itself as a word already sounds abstract and sort of technical. But really, when you talk about we want to get in there and hear all the details of the voice, then it clicks for me. It's that what we really want and what we're drawn to in timbre is indications of the message that we're trying to receive. So for a human voice, it's the words, it's the note, it's the muscles, it's the energy, it's the emotion. And then, you know, other instruments similarly, like Django Reinhardt's guitar, it's the note choice, it's the tone and stuff like that, because it makes us understand the confidence in the fingering and the body, you know, the communication. Then it gets abstract. Then you're like, okay, what about bass music? Well, it's like, okay, well, there's something there that's trying to be communicated to us, and that will become the timbre for that kind of music.
This is beautiful. Like I will steal this off you and put it in in another book. But this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like we want the information. And information is in all these tiny details. Like, what material hit that other object? Was it a wooden object? Was it big or small? And we're really biologically interested in getting that information. We want to know what caused the sound. Where was it at? And was there any particular meaning embedded in that sound?
Yeah, did he hit it softly or loud?
Yeah,
was he angry when he hit it?
Was he angry? That's a really important question for us to know, and it has little to do with music, but we can use the fact that we're so interested in that information to create art and to use it as for expressive purposes.
Yeah.
But we're actually much less interested in reflected sound, and in space. Actually, what the brain does is it tries to suppress reverb. It tries to suppress the reflections, and is actually great at it. You know this because if you're walking around in a recording room, you think, oh, this sounds fairly dry. And if I listen to the instrument, it sounds fairly well when I'm over here. Let's place the microphone there. And then you hear, okay, but what the microphone does is it picks up all these reflections. And when you listen to that signal, all the reflections are folded down to like one new virtual sound source containing the source and all the reflections. We can't separate them out anymore. And you hear, okay, now my brain can't suppress the reflections anymore. And you hear a hollow bathroom type of sound, And for me, this is very important. I'm not saying not to have any reflections, but the reflections that you do have in your recording work best if the brain is able to isolate them, suppress them, and interpret them as a sense of space. Like, okay, I heard that there was a delay coming from there. I took it down, not consciously, obviously, but this all happens automatically. But it's interpreted as we're in a space of such and such size, and the source has a particular width, and so it's all information being interpreted. And what I'm a bit scared of when we move into like complex three-dimensional microphone systems and multi-channel delivery formats is that we will try to emulate existing spaces and try to project them in other spaces. And I even consider a pair of headphones a virtual space that somebody is just committed to listening in, and it will recombine with that space. So it will form this weird hybrid. And in most living rooms, there's actually quite a lot of reflections going on, and it will be like the more speakers you add, the messier it will get. Sometimes it becomes just, this is the podcast to be honest, right? Yeah, I'm maybe of a different opinion than the majority of engineers I hear talking about this subject nowadays, because there's a lot of new technology being rolled out and there's a lot of developments. And sure, I want to have a good business as well. And I think if the music industry can have just good income and good business coming via those technologies or because of those technologies, it's a great development. But I've been at demonstrations where the more complicated the system got, everybody got more enthusiastic of all the technology involved, and then it sounded like, yeah, okay, it's fine. I'm not really convinced yet. And then somebody else had a demonstration and they played back a stereo recording made 50 years ago or so on the same speaker system. And it just, even in a big hall and with really nice equipment, it just blew my mind. Like, okay, I'm resonating to this. I'm feeling this as music. And it didn't have anything to do with the actual music. I'd liked the other music as well. But it was just like more real. And this is weird because we have all this technology to make stuff sound more real or more enveloping or more immersive. but it actually sometimes becomes less real because it's so much and can be so confusing. And then there's some, you know, I actually quite like the pseudo mono Bluetooth speaker in my living room, and you just have the sensation of, okay, there's the music. The music is coming from there,
Yeah.
and you get used to it. And I feel immersed because I'm in the same space as the music, and that's my house. And and it sounds, I think, convincingly enough for me just to be engaged with the music. And I've also been like at my parents. My dad is quite a technology enthusiast, and he bought like a surround system and stuff. And sometimes I enter the house and I'm just sitting at their table, listening to music in the background. But then it never really sounds as nice because it's coming from all different directions, and the signals are mixed in a weird way, and I think it's just less lifelike. If you sit at his sacred spot on the couch, it sounds pretty good. But, I'm not sure whether that's my main objective. I think a lot of people will miss out if we make that the main objective.
Every studio needs a good vintage mic for that classic warm sound. Whether you're looking for those airy highs, sweet mid-range, or silky low-end, a good vintage mic can put the magic in your mixes. So it's no wonder vintage mics have been loved and praised by thousands of engineers for decades. The JZ Microphone Vintage Series are built by hand in Latvia using only the best electronic components and feature the patented golden drop capsule design for great detail and richness of tone that will bring that classic vintage vibe to your studio and be a real workhorse for your sessions. This time, our friends at JZ Microphones have come up with a special offer only available to you, Rockstars. Use the limited time coupon ROCKSTAR to get 40% off the Vintage Series mics V67, V47, and V12, the mic you're hearing right now, at jzmic.com. Do you want to record killer drums in your home studio? Rockstars of Drums will show you how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with examples from a Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Do you want to know how to master your own music at home? Rockstars of Mastering will show you how with plugins in your DAW so that your music will sound awesome when you finish your mixes. And if you're looking for a step-by-step solution for a pro-sounding mix that won't take years to learn, the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass with Craig Alvin will show you a proven method for creating Grammy-winning quality mixes that you can apply in your home studio right now. Or if you just need to learn the fundamentals of creating a great sounding mix, then register for my free course Mix Master Bundle to get great mixes using simple free plugins. And get started now making your best record ever at recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy. Use the code ROCKSTAR at checkout to get 10% off any course for a limited time. Howdy, Rockstars. We're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Wessel Oltheten, joining us from his studio in the Netherlands. Wessel, are you ready to jam?
Sure, I am.
All right. So we were talking a little bit about this, just the ways that you listen to music, which is, the ways that our music is dictated by choices about recording it, like the one mic thing, the ways that our music is dictated in our experience, depending on how many speakers it's delivered to us and stuff like that. But one of the things that I really love to come back to too, because when we talk about the timbre of music and focusing on the stuff that feels like, brings out the emotion, brings out these elements of the performance. I know that you have paid a lot of close attention to your mixing setup. You've got a system that allows you to digitally, I think, patch in different hardware and outboard gear for sounds and effects. But you also broke down for us on the last podcast a really cool and somewhat elaborate. I don't know if it was terribly elaborate or not to you, but a multi-bus mixing system where you have different different places maybe you can send the music to, and it's going to enhance the sounds, whether it's drums or percussion or whether it's background vocals and strings, things like that. And I recently had Michael Brower back on the podcast, and he what I understand of him and his mixing is he has a similar attitude towards, well, if this thing sounds great for this element of music, let's send some of it over there. So what has changed for you in that multi-bus routing setup as far as your, how it works and your concept? And then maybe give us a brief reintroduction to it, or talk to us a little bit about, let's just say that we decided, I love this sound that I get in my studio, and I love this sound over here, and I love this sound over here. If we wanted to incorporate that into our mixing template, what are some smart ways to think about that multiple routing and how we can have a little bit of this? It's almost like spices when you're cooking in the kitchen. It's, I want a little of this, I want a little of that,
To me, it has to do with the way a sound image works and the way music works. Like, music has a component that is moving. There's always movement in time, and there's always stuff that we can synchronize to. So we listen to, okay, what is the sequence of movements here, and is there a common denominator? And that's the metric structure, and you immediately get a sense. It's almost universally so. I think it's universally so for people all over the world. We start bobbing along with our heads and start moving to the music. So I'd call that like a more the mechanics of music. It gets things moving. And for me, that is one very important component in the sound image. And for me, that's a part where compression can play a role, but not a big role, because it tends to weaken the movement. So that's one part of my setup, is actually allowing the drums or things that are meant to make things move, and especially also low end, to pass through pretty much uncompressed. And another thing that can sort of be in the way of good movement is that when the accents that are being played by percussive elements, that they become too sharp or too bright. And then you feel like the emphasis of the beat is raising in the frequency spectrum, and it feels too light. I get a sense of feeling a bit out of breath or a bit restless, and it doesn't feel like it's properly anchored down and part of the same composite movement that you want to have going. And then it's not a matter of adding more low end, because it tends to muddy everything up, and there you have all your problems with masking. But it's just the sharpness of it. It's the nature of the sound. You hit something with a stick, you get a sharp transient. You hit a metal object, you get like very harsh harmonics and disharmonics.
Except for cowbell.
Except for cowbell, obviously. The cowbell pretty much anywhere you can just have it. But then that also evolved in my mixing template. I'm pretty sure in 90% of the times I need some form of saturation or peak management to get the transients to sound round enough. And that's pertinent to that percussion high end you're talking about, right? Yeah. So this is one element of my mixing setup. It's just no compression on the rhythm bus, but the right amount of, sometimes a bit of EQ, but mostly the right amount of cushioning to tuck in the transients so that they don't take on a life of their own, that they don't stick out of the sound image. I want to have them be real parts of the movement and sound, nice and rounded usually.
So let me ask you this. When you're arriving at what you like the sound of for that, would you just take raw drums that don't have anything on it and kind of listen through some stuff and go, I like how that does that effect? Or would you sort of mix the drums with compression and other things going, and then this is just a little bit of filtering on top.
This is subtle stuff, and in the end, all the subtle stuff added together makes a world of difference. Like sometimes you really notice the difference of that this setup can make if people bring me stuff to master and they're unsure of the mix and they bring me stems. I don't do it often because I think it's a difficult way of working also, but you can mess up a lot of good stuff that they had going in the process.
Right.
But okay. But sometimes it happens that if you line up these stems and just match levels and with the mix that they had going, that just purely by running it through my setup, I create more differentiation between the different parts. The drums get more room to breathe. And the other stuff gets more compressed, actually. So some instruments in the mid-range, I tend to compress more. The vocal, I tend to compress less and in a different way, so it sits really easily in front of everything else. And the reverbs I tend not to compress, so that if everything becomes louder, then everything gets compressed except the reverbs and the drums. And then you can sort of, it almost makes it feel more powerful because you change the balance between, well, some of the wet and dry automatically. The compression scheme does it for you. So if I push faders or if musicians are starting to play louder, the instruments get more compressed, the vocal also gets more compressed, the drums are still banging, and the reverbs come up more in relationship. So yeah, that's one of the ways the template or the setup works. And it's no truth by any means, but it just works very well quite often.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of take it for granted, and so I'm not fiddling with the settings, and I just roll with it. And maybe in a year or so, I'm going to change something. But and what has changed since last time we talked is I became more mindful of why I don't like processing on the entire mix as much. I became more critical of what it does, and I think I'm also more critical about having colored equipment on the full stereo master.
Mm-hmm.
Like, since I'm doing so much mastering work, there's a lot of critical listening involved. And do I want to use this piece of gear on the chain or not? And what does it do? And I've sort of gravitated towards equipment that actually sounds fairly clean. Sometimes there's a tube circuit involved, but you if you wouldn't know, you couldn't ever pinpoint that as, oh, I hear a warm analog color. No, it's much more subtle than what the average person would think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it keeps everything so much more open and lifelike. And what I'm now consciously thinking about all this is that it must have a lot to do with intermodulation distortion. Like if you distort a complex signal, you get harmonics that aren't related in terms of harmonic overtone. So you don't get octaves and fifths and stuff like that, but you also get all the sum and difference parts between all the frequencies involved. And if you look at a full range mixed material, then there is almost every frequency, every part of the frequency spectrum has substantial energy in it. So if you start distorting that, then it becomes blurry,
everything everywhere,
very quickly. So I had all this gear that has a lot of options of coloring the sound, and I just compared it, and I ended up taking it out of the chain. And what I end up with is gear that is more frequency selective on the master. So for instance, I use like an analog saturation device by Giraffe Audio. They're from Denmark and a great company. And they make this thing called the Giratech 21. And it's like Madman's device. It even says use with caution on the front panel. But actually it can sound very nice and very subtle. And what this does is it allows me to apply the saturation I'm after only on a particular frequency band. And it uses passive filtering, very gentle slopes, very little phase shift. It just sounds pretty clean and natural on its own. But if you need a bit of warmth, or if you need a bit of rounding off of transients, you can dial it in only where the problem occurs.
And
And
you think about that like a mastering tool.
yeah, but it got me thinking. Like, okay, this is about the only type of coloration device I'm now liking on my master, and it's not always. I also master things that have been done in the box by people who don't really know how to get a warm sound in the box. So you end up with a very refined, but overly defined, kind of harsh sounding mix. And then I can pull out all the stops. Then it's just a tube compressor running into a tube EQ, and stacking it, and it still sounds actually maybe even not warm enough then. It's all context dependent, obviously, but in my case, there's already quite some coloring going on individual sources. And then the further I get in the mixing system, so the further down the busing we get, the more complex the signals become and the less tolerant I become of the wrong kind of distortion. And I think this is very much similar to why the old guys used to upgrade the mix buses in their analog consoles with better electronics and more headroom. They like to overdrive the line amp of the input channel, but they don't like to overdrive the entire mix.
Hearing you describe it, it's making me think that it makes plenty of sense, this idea that the more complex the signal is, which is usually what the mix itself is, that saturation just kind of makes a mess of things, versus saturation can be wonderful at the right stage. So it's almost like saturation belongs at the beginning of your chain, not so much at the end,
Quite often, one of an extreme example I came across of this is, if you think about it, it's the same reason why electric guitar players who play in heavy bands tend to leave the third or the seventh out of the chord. So they play a power chord. And they get more consonant harmonics with the distortion that way. So they get like a sub-octave, and it lines up pretty nicely when you just heavily distort such a signal. But if you play the third, okay, now it's very dense and very dissonant. And
sometimes the best part is just one note with the distortion.
Exactly. And now we're getting at my example. I found out a guy who did like a guitar with separate outputs per string out of the element. So, and then run these separate outputs into 6 big muffs. So you could separately distort each note of the chord. So then you would just have that one note, and then it remains harmonic. And that's the key of this weird way of thinking. Like, if you distort a monophonic signal, most of the distortion components, or the loudest distortion components, tend to be harmonically related. So octaves and fifths and thirds, and it sounds full-bodied and nice and rich, and all the stuff that people say about these things. But if you have more complex signals, it becomes less easy to have the sound remain open, and it becomes very noisy and densely packed with dissonant harmonics. So, I sort of started to apply that thinking in my mixing, and I'm doing more at the individual sources and less at the buses. And the stuff I'm doing at the buses is actually fairly clean, and it is more a thing of positioning. Like the stuff I'm doing on the vocal is I have my trusty TubeTech multiband compressor. I've been using that for like 10 years or so now. And it just works if I want to have the vocal up loud in the mix. It compresses it a bit, only slightly, but it compresses the harshest components first. So that allows you to push it a bit further without the vocal detaching from everything else. And so I found these little solutions for common problems, like in any sound image, the stuff you want to present closest to the listener, the biggest danger is not that you turn it, that you place it too soft, but that you place it too loud, and that it detaches from everything else, and then it becomes its own world, and then you don't have music anymore, and this maybe to come back to the immersive part for a very tiny amount of time, is something that is a very delicate balance, you know? That's why you can make it work in a stereo system, and you start messing with half a dB more vocal, half a dB less, and then it sits right. And if you change it by like a couple of dBs, it's totally off, and it detaches from the sound image. And this happens much more easily if the singer is coming from one speaker and if the music is coming from other speakers. Then you don't have control over such a delicate balance. And so that's the stuff that is dear to me. You know, it's in the details. And the setup helps me get there.
For 15 years, I recorded hundreds of bands like Jack White, Adele, and the Black Keys in my Hay Bale studio at the Bonnaroo Festival. I had to work fast and deliver finished mixes to the radio DJs within an hour, so I chose to use the solid-state Logic AWS 948 Plus for my mixing console. There's just no substitute for mixing on a real console. Until now, that is. SSL brings you the UF8 and UC1 controllers so that you can recreate the feel and speed of mixing on a console with the flexibility of mixing on your computer in your home studio. Paired with the SSL Channel Strip 2 and 4000B plugins, you can now get a world-class sound using real faders and real knobs to mix as fast as your ears will guide you. Levels, panning, EQ, and compression, they're all built right into the controllers. So go put the feeling back into your mixes at solidstatelogic.com. Atom Audio introduces the new A7V monitor for home and pro studios, the next generation of the incredibly popular A7X. The all-new A-series line of monitors delivers the same highly accurate, transparent sound and unique accelerated ribbon tweeter design that has made Atom Audio famous for over a decade, but now introduces new innovations such as the rotatable high-frequency propagation system waveguide, allowing the XART tweeter to disperse sound with controlled consistency, and DSP-based room correction and speaker voicings. Using the A-Control software or SonarWorks and a measurement mic, you can now integrate advanced filters directly onto the DSP on board the speaker to help compensate for imperfect room acoustics without introducing annoying latency or requiring plugins. This allows you to tune your monitors for your room, your mix position, and your ears anytime you want to meet your ever-evolving studio needs. Get the extended 5-year warranty for monitors that will improve as your studio improves at atomaudio.com. Well, just to flip, because I like to always play devil's advocate, just to flip that around as an opposite way of saying is when Roger Moutinho was on the podcast, he talked about actually, I think it was just talking to me personally one time. I was talking about mixing, and he just said, like, when you make a change to something, when you want to, turn the tambourine up, don't turn it up a half dB, turn it up 3 dBs, turn it up, like, make really bold mix decisions because it creates a bigger depth in the music. I think artistically is the way he was seeing it. And I think that's a kind of a fun opposite way to think about it too, is just recognize. So I think he was saying, artistically, sometimes it's nice to separate things and make them kind of crazy because you get a bold statement,
Yeah, but the thing is, that's the artist's job to think about these things. And once you arrive at a certain design, then you would want it to be preserved.
Yeah.
And that's where my being cautious is coming from.
Well, it's working for you because your discography sounds amazing. So I'm looking at notes from last time, and I found my scribble scrabble about your mix bus setup, where you've got a rhythm bus with low and high with tape and no compression. You've got a musical wallpaper bus with high and saturation. You've got a foreground bus for vocals and guitar solo. And you have a bypass bus of nothing, and all of that going to a master bus. So that doesn't really sound super complex. It just sounds, It sounds like some tonal choices. The musical wallpaper is the so high in saturation, but what's the thinking behind that?
Now, basically, there's also one of the things that a frequency-dependent saturator will help you to understand is if you saturate low end, we'll do simple math. We'll saturate 50 hertz. The first harmonic, 100 hertz. Second harmonic, 150, 200, 250, 300, 350, etc., etc., etc. So we end up somewhere in the high end, 10K, 10K 50, 10K 100, etc. So it's that densely packed if you really saturate it heavily. And now do the same math for a high frequency that can be harsh to the ears, like 5K in a cymbal. 5K, first harmonic, 10K, second harmonic, 15K. So that's an octave and a fifth, right? And third harmonic, 20K. Okay, we're outside the human hearing range. So all the added harmonics are a consonant. So it's much less bothersome to distort high frequencies than low frequencies. And I'm not saying you don't need saturation on low frequencies. Maybe it's a good disclaimer that the truth is not out there. That's something I've been saying more often lately. The further I get into it and the more I think about things, the more I come to the conclusion that it's all dependent on what you want and what you are trying to achieve. And so there's no general rule to be given. But if you ask me, what do you like about high frequency saturation, then it's exactly that. So I can leave the low end untouched, and especially with the complex material, the low end, like saturating the low end of a mix, I find that very hard to do because the low mids are usually already packed and then it becomes totally messy there. Yeah. I find that with good clean EQ, I can get the low end to work and keep the mid-range natural, and it is usually way more powerful and defined that way. The high end is a different matter because sometimes I want to EQ out certain nasty resonances that you can get off, like the acoustic effects of a capsule or a grill. Like the U47 has this 10K ringing bell on top of it, and sometimes I don't want it. I try to tame it a bit with EQ. But some of the things are just like dynamic issues with harsh transients. And then you can just saturate those slightly, not mess with the low end or the low mids, and they start to feel soft and part of the image all of a sudden. So I'm really liking what saturation can do, and also I'm liking the fact that it sort of retains more of the signal than a limiter would do, because I'm really not liking the effect of things being ducked down. And the limiting action, you hear attack, you hear release, you hear the gain modulation happening. And with saturation, it's not necessarily taking down the energy, but more redistributing the energy, If you have one narrow 5K peak and you saturate it, the energy doesn't dissipate, it just spreads out, and it's now also located at 10 and 15K.
That's fascinating.
And it's but it's still part of the same source. So you don't feel that the symbol is being held back. It's just spread out when it gets harsh.
And when we hear more harmonics, we have an easier time hearing the instrument too. Yeah. We identify it more readily, which I'm guessing maybe allows you to turn it down in volume a little bit because you can still hear it in the mix.
Well, yeah, you're right, but it depends on the context in the mix, I'd say like you can look at distortion as a way of spreading out energy. And if your problem is, okay, my instrument is located at a very, it has a lot of energy only at the fundamental frequencies, but nowhere else, then usually you have a problem because you can't turn it up that much because it starts to mask every other instrument in the mix. And then spreading out some of the energy works. So you saturate that sort of closely located energy and spread it out to more frequency bands. But the other way around can also be true, that if something is already noisy or has a wide band frequency spectrum, and then you then try to saturate it to make it more audible, you're only actually worsening the problem. So sometimes for those type of sounds, like sawtooth synth pads, really densely packed with harmonics or heavily distorted sounds, if you want to make them audible in a mix without drowning everything else, you need to refocus the energy, actually. So what you then do is what an amplifier, for instance, does. If you run a fuzz bass through an amplifier, you'll end up with the filtering characteristics of the cabinet and the speaker, and it takes down some of the harshness, and it creates a bump in the lows, and there you have a new frequency spectrum for that sound to live in. Actually, one of my favorite plugins, I'm not a big plugin user, but one of my favorite plugins is actually Speakerphone by Audio Ease, which is like a reamping device. They recorded I don't know how many, but I think there's almost like 500 different impulse responses in there, of everything from toys to phones to bigger speaker systems, all the guitar cabinets, bass cabinets, every type of speaker system. And these basically they're filters, right? So you'd say, okay, I can get any digital EQ and just create something reminiscent of that, but the filters are so complex that you can't recreate it with an average digital EQ. And they sound, well, real to the ear, like an acoustic bass cabinet sounds real to the ear. There is just so much complexity in there, like all the edges of a cabinet have a part in the diffraction characteristics, and they're all at different frequencies and different times, and it becomes this very densely, actually smooth sounding, but also colored filter characteristic. And I really enjoy just taking synth sounds or sounds that are just to my ear to blend. So to average sounding, to really cut through a mix, I run it through that, and it becomes filtered in some unpredictable way, and it has more character and also leaves more room for everything else. So you create a space for it in that way.
Yeah, that's cool. I really like hearing you talk about this stuff. Because I love how it opens your eyes and opens your ways of thinking about music and choices when you start just realizing that some of it is very basic and it's simple, like the idea of, the overtones of a low frequency signal and what happens when you saturate it versus, the saturation of the higher frequency and how quickly it gets, a few steps and you're out of bounds. And so you don't have to worry about it. Whereas the low stuff fills up everything. And it also reminds me of a guitar player that I knew in St. Louis, and he was known to have this really amazing guitar rig and tone and everything. His name's Obad Khan, and he designed and built guitar amps there and still does. Khan, I think. Well, anyway, I don't want to butcher the name. He's had a couple of different amp companies, so he's got one now that's. But he does amp heads and stuff. Anyway, when I heard him play guitar, and he had this AC30 cabinet, and I think it was a Strat, and it just sounded, it was like one of the best guitar sounds I'd heard and I was 20 or something, 21, and I was like, holy shit, that sounds amazing. What is that? What are you doing? And he was explaining to me that what made the whole thing sound so good was because the guitar would break up where it was clean and clear on the low end and the low strings and the low tone. And it only broke up the higher frequencies in the top. So it had this really great, like the guitar could sound really full, but it still had like crunch and attitude and rock and roll to it. And hearing you describe it now, it's like, duh.
Yeah.
It's like if we just figure that kind of thinking out in our mix too. The OWC Envoy Pro Electron is your super fast and rugged pocket-sized portable USB-C SSD that keeps your music safe in the studio or on the stage. With storage of up to 2 terabytes and speeds of up to more than a gigabyte per second, the OWC Envoy Pro Electron gives you high-speed audio data for recording and playback. Take your sessions and sample libraries with you anywhere you go. Built for reliability, the OWC Envoy Pro Electron is waterproof, dustproof, and crush-proof, so there's no need to worry about your music anymore. Find the new Envoy Pro Electron and all your storage needs at macsales.com/rockstars and use the custom link below in our show notes because it's a great way for you to help support this podcast. So thanks, Rockstars. There's a lot of junk that needs to get cleaned up in a podcast or music mix. Boomy pops on the microphones, piercing sibilants, background noise, harshness, distortion, wild dynamics, and EQ correction. And all this editing and mixing cleanup would be impossibly time-consuming were it not for the magic of iZotope RX, Ozone, and Neutron. iZotope gives you a collection of plugins for mixing in your DAW to manage plosives, clicks, S's, noise, buzz, reverb, breaths, and even guitar fret squeaks with set it and forget it simplicity. Check out the new Repair Assistant plugin to help you find the perfect mix prep settings for any instrument. And the standalone RX app includes new features like text transcription and multiple speaker recognition for easy editing and navigation. Try out the subscription option with an extended 30-day free trial at iZotope.com/rockstars or use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off any individual plugin purchase. So let me spin that back at you with your multi-bus routing and things like that. Let's say you had a mix that has kind of that sub bass or 808 kind of tones. It's got low, it's electronic maybe. And you've also got snare tones that need to go with that and percussive, subdivision, higher frequencies. How would you approach your system where the lows are getting that clarity, but the highs are getting a little more, maybe they're getting a little bit of the crunch and stuff? Are you bussing things? Would you take a loop that has all that in there and bus it to multiple places, or would we need to have separate elements of what I just described, and now we're busing some of it over here and some of it over there? Maybe that's too vague a question, but I think what I mean, right?
It's not a vague question. It's just a very particular question, and I find it very difficult to answer because to describe one particular case is it can potentially be the exception to the rule, but I'm not sure what the meaning would be, So let me think about this.
You can't hear the sound in my head right now. But I mean,
let me rephrase your question a bit,
Sure.
and I'll reinterpret it. Like, what you're basically asking is, do you treat objects with different frequencies in them differently and stuff like that? I'd say it all depends on their musical role. And what I first listen for is movement, rhythm. And what I'm talking about is composite rhythm. So it's the way that the bass interacts with the kick, that it interacts with the snare. And the way I explain this to people, because I always have clients over when I do mastering, for instance, and they're surprised that mastering has so much to do with getting the music to move in the right way. But that is very much connected to having good low end. And if you get the low end to work well and to be evenly balanced, then it improves musical movement quite a lot. And people are surprised, like, wow, it starts to groove now. So let me explain how I approach that. That is all got to do with how I think about groove. And I'd say the groove is like a circle. It's like a wheel that is spinning. And there are different parts of the wheel. So some parts create little bumps, and there you have movement. And if one part of the wheel has a big bump in it, you sort of slows the wheel down a bit. And that part gets a lot of attention, but it also takes quite a while to recover from such a part. So that's a big accent in the rhythm that you're experiencing there. It also takes recovery time. And what happens quite a lot is that people who focus on frequencies, they want to have like big low end or nice extended low end like they have in reference track such and such. But then you usually create like big notches in the wheel, and there's no room for all the other smaller accents that are also part of a groove to do their thing. And it becomes more static. You start hearing, okay, this is very much centered on the quarter note, and there is 16th movement in between, but I'm not hearing it. Or this should sound shuffled or laid back in some way, but it's just not happening. And then usually one of the parts is just sort of holding the groove back. And usually it's because it's too loud or too low positioned in the frequency spectrum in terms of emphasis. So there is where my work starts. I'm really listening to what is that 808 type of noise doing. Is it part of the rhythm, or is it part of a more static extension of the chord? That can also happen, and then it doesn't need to move, but then it also needs to be out of the way of the rhythm. The rhythm needs to move, you know? And then this is also dependent on the tempo of the piece, and also dependent on how many notes make up the groove. So are we playing 16ths, or are we playing 8 notes, or is it way more open, sparsely arranged? It can also happen that you have room for like the biggest low end ever. If you only play an accent every bar or so and have very small stuff in between, you can have this big wheel which is not round anymore, but it will still every time it will make the circle round, it will repeat itself, and that repetition of movement is what we like so much in music. That's what you recognize, and it doesn't need to be tight, you know. It doesn't need to be to a click track or to a grid. As long as we can recognize that there is a pattern in there, and it's repeating, it's consistent, and maybe varying within that consistency, it sounds like music. So that's where I start. Like, how does this song need to move? How does this need to groove? And then I figure out what different EQ settings, how they affect the movement. And I go for, the movement I feel the most, like the movement that wants to get me to move the most. So if I'm really into it, and I'll be moving in the studio, sadly sitting down on a chair usually, but like bobbing my head, stamping my feet, and really feeling whether it does what it needs to do. And sometimes the movement is not meant to dance to, and it's more delicate and drawn out, and then it's a different mood. But I think I don't need to explain how we experience music. If you're listening to the podcast, you know the feeling.
Yeah, that's probably why you're here. But so again, just on a mechanical aspect, if you have multiple buses, if you have these 4 buses that you might use in your mix and they all feed the master bus, how would you send an instrument? Would you send it to one of the buses, or might you send it to both of the buses? I guess that's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, one of the buses. I think both of the buses is Michael Brauer territory, and it's getting over my head. So for me, it offers enough control. And yeah, so I'm also quite, I'm not sure whether that's actually a well-funded fear that I have, but afraid of facing differences between the different buses. Like some of the processing I'm using employs filters, and then you get very, unexpected effects sometimes.
Well, again, your discography speaks for itself. So there's a high fidelity and a clarity and a focus in there. And the songs, you know, as I flip through, what's striking to me is we're talking about indie rock, we're talking about art rock, we're talking about electronic music, we're talking about sensitive song singers with a, you know, a bleeding heart vocal that needs to be right here in your face. And we're talking about jazz bands, and I'm sure you've got orchestral stuff in there. And yet all of your work seems to have a consistent not getting in the wayness, openness, like the music breathes through like it's trying to do. And that's, it's hard to do that. It's tricky to have that kind of consistency. So well done, man.
Well, thank you. I think I had a piece of advice that really stuck with me. Like I had this mentor and he said, if you do it well, the speakers disappear. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, the big system that I got going here is so transparent that it disappears pretty easily. But I also have like a smaller system for reference, which is more your average hi-fi bookshelf speaker, and it's just in the back of the room, not in the same stereo position that I got the main system going. And I know that it's right if I succeed in creating a cloud of sound that extends beyond the size of those speakers, even coming from the back of the room. I can't explain it better than that. It's just a matter of grinding it out and arriving at that moment where it sort of projects well. And the weird thing is, I couldn't measure when that is happening or in any way sort of formalize what that is. But I'm fairly certain when I arrive there. Sometimes I'm mixing or mastering something, and then I'm struggling with the last details, and then I hear it just click into place. And then I've learned to stop. Then, not just because of the children, but also because I've learned that I've just never improved beyond that point. So I've learned to trust the instinct of hearing it click and then just letting it be. And also, it's not always right, but there is no chance in hell that I'm going to be able to tell whether it's right or not. So I only have that gut feeling to go by, and I've learned, okay, I'm going to be trusting that feeling for the next couple of weeks. And I'm just going to try and see whether the client wants to live with this for a bit and get used to it. And I'm going to do the same. And then sometimes after such a period, you think, okay, but this really isn't finished yet. But then usually you don't do a minor tweak to such a mix or such a master. You do it fully, you do the entire thing again with a different plan, with a different outset of, because you've now realized what it needs to be. And I think that's similar to the advice that you got from I can't remember his name, of making bold choices. Like,
yeah, Roger.
You really go for it, you turn it up loud. And I'm also a fan of just having a plan. And the plan can also be like, we're going for an intimate natural sound, and there don't need to be like bold artistic choices in there. It's more delicate, but I'm very mindful of, okay, that is the plan. And I'm not going to do any other plan or any in-between plan or any tweak to this plan that sort of strays from the path. This is what we're creating. And that becomes easier with time. I guess I had much more trouble with this when I was younger and had less experience, and especially less different genres that I had worked in. You just don't know the possibilities, and there's always that sense of adventure of, okay, but what if? And now I'm just thinking, yeah, but at this stage, I'm not going to ask what if and jeopardize everything. I'm just going to go with what we set out to do.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at your discography. So, for example, you've got, you talked about sometimes it just needs to be sensitive. So, like Matt Winson is one of the records in there, and he's just got, it's a singing voice that's just like right up here, And Pocket Knife Army is another one. When I hear that, where I'm just like, I love the electronic stuff that's going on there.
Yeah.
So let me ask you about that next. Do you feel like the time you've spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has not gotten you anywhere? Have you been looking for a simple or straightforward step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? What if you could learn that process from a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is for you. Now you can discover a proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Here's a quote from one of the students. Absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information mentoring on the mix process I've ever been a part of. This was like sitting behind a mix engineer for years, watching and picking up tips along the way, condensed into a 6 to 7 hour session. Look, when you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then go to ultimatemixingmasterclass.com and go check out Craig's ultimate snare mixing trick now for free. In Pocket Knife Army, what are some elements of mixing that you remember as far as, anything that just comes to mind, instrumentation or like ways that you dealt with some of those electronic sounds and, maybe plug-in choices or not plug-in choices that you would make?
Actually, what is a big part of those records is that they do a live performance. It doesn't sound like it because it's electronic music, but my friend Erwin, who is half of that duo, they're a duo. He's just a madman when it comes to electronics, and he does things with analog sequencing where there's nothing aligned to a grid, and tempo is also moving fluently. And they're just playing along with that and they're doing quite a lot of contrasts and movements already in recording it. And then the danger with electronic music is that the sources lack context. Like what we've talked about a lot is, recording acoustic music and getting that sound image like you would record it with a Bloom line ideally. And all that nice stuff that just works for us because we're humans living in an acoustic world. So if you synthesize a sound, you also need to think of it's gonna live in a particular context, and that is acoustic. There's no way around it. So what they did is already record some acoustic elements, which helps to get this record to sound more lifelike. But they've also recorded some elements to tape, which takes out some of the edge of those nasty transients that I've also been describing a bit. And I think what a tape machine does very well is just it jitters a bit in time, and then it saturates the high end, and it makes transients just more diffuse or less defined, if you will, in a nice way. And I think those type of effects are very hard to accomplish. That you can't do this with reverb, for instance, because it's always too late. So what you would need is to look at the source. And I've started thinking about this, like you have instruments that naturally sound softer or more sharp, independent of playing style, just by the construction of the instrument. An instrument with a big sounding body with like a violin or an acoustic guitar with a top plate, it just spreads out the sound in space and time quite a bit because of the construction. And then the transient is diffused in a very nice way, and it makes it into a more mellow type of sound. And that also can only be captured at a distance. If you close mic, we all know, I guess, transients become sharper. And try it with a snare drum. The closer you get, the sharper it sounds. And the further away you get, the more of all these wonderful components that such an instrument is generating are averaging out the instrument's envelope. And they create, more rounded sounding transients. So if you think about electronic music, then there's a challenge in there. And I think it's no coincidence that people work in classical music and jazz really don't rely on very colored sounding equipment anymore. it's usually pretty pristine sounding. While if you look at genres of EDM or more experimental electronic or hip hop, the saturation is all over the place.
Yeah.
You know, it's everywhere, and they can, and especially in hip hop, you can have quite a lot of it before you run into any of the issues that I've described earlier. You know, even in the entire mix of a hip hop track, there's so little overlap between elements, and there's so much space in between that you can allow for that intermodulation, distortion, and all the stuff that is potentially very damaging for, let's say, a jazz record. So I think that the things that I employed in mixing that record is I've tried to create spaces for those electronic sounds to live in, and you can get pretty creative with that because you don't need to do it with natural sounding reverbs. I think the second record we only use delay as just like an example of one of these artistic choices that just lead to different sounds. They just said to me, okay, we don't want reverb. And the reverb you hear was already in their source. And for the rest, I only used different delay devices. And actually, that, come to think of it, that's something I do a lot. Because as a mixer especially as a mixer, you have limited control over source material. You know, you can't change what people recorded or the way that they arranged music, and sometimes you just run into difficulties to get the music to really work and sit well together. For instance, the voice can be, because of its pitch range and because of the type of expression that the singer used, it can be so bright that it's almost impossible to connect it to the other instruments, even with my average setup. What I tend to do is not make it into a problem, because then you start notching out all the life of the vocal. No, you have to accept this is what it is. That this is the choice that they made. But what I can do is paint the background, so to speak. And there you have a lot of freedom just to add things that balance out that particular harshness. You know, one of the things I sometimes reference or play students are those old records by the Smashing Pumpkins, which are, you know, my youth as well. But when you hear Billy Corgan sing, it's such a typical voice. And, you know, I had to, when I first heard it on good speakers, when I was a bit older than when I used to listen to it, I was like, does it sound like this? What? I almost reached for an EQ to notch out that particular, I don't know where it's located,
like a readiness in his
3.5
voice,
K or something like that. So like, a nastiness. And, you know, they made it into a feature. It's just what he does and how he sounds. And they positioned the vocal quite low in the mix. And it works. Expressively, it works very well, you know, and you can still hear him. And you're actually intrigued as a listener of, okay, what is this? What is he doing? And he sort of draws you in by being mixed low with a characterful vocal sound. And to me, that's like where I get my inspiration from, such records that sound a bit, off kilter, you know. It's a bit...
Start with take a problem and make it a feature.
Yeah.
You know, that expression. I remember hearing Butch Vig talk about trying to figure that out. And, you know, they would notch EQ, sidechain, the compressors and stuff to try and pull that back a little more, you know, and that was before... I can't remember. Does the distressor have that in it? No, but the plug-in distressor does. You know, that kind of ability to guide the EQ of the sidechain a little bit more. Yeah, the distressor had that little dip thing there for that kind of thing. Well, that's awesome, dude. Well, man, this is fun, and it's fun to hear you talk about all this. We are at the end of our time, but what great concepts for thinking about how to mix music and everything. And I want to remind the rock stars to please go check out Wessel's book. He's written a wonderful book that we talked about a little bit last time, but we didn't talk about it much now. But Mixing with Impact, which you can find on did they pronounce it Focal Press or Focal Press?
Focal Press. I don't know.
Press,
I'm Dutch. So
okay, right.
Yeah.
Well, you're supposed to speak all the languages then.
Yeah, but they have it on Amazon, and that's everywhere. So
yeah. So Wessel really dives in deeply into all these ways of thinking about mixing, and it's a lot of fun. And I think there's a lot of great experiments in there too for sound, right?
Yeah, it's written to make you think and experiment yourself. I don't want to tell people what to do. That's basically the concept of the book.
Yeah. Well, very cool. Well, Wessel, thank you so much for being on Recording Studio Rockstars with us. Let me ask my closing question, which I've asked before, but I always just keep asking it over and over again. This is hypothetical. We get to take the Wayback Studio machine and you go back in time and find young Wessel mixing away, no kids, just in life in the studio all the time. And you say, listen, I've come back to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day. What advice would you go back and give yourself if you could?
Go for it and don't waste time on stuff that you know deep down inside you don't believe in. And well, a belief can come from many different things. It doesn't always have to be the music that you're most into. You can also get that belief from a learning opportunity, doing something completely different and doing that for a couple of months and then knowing, okay, that's a period and I'm closing it off. But I've really became more selective in the type of job I'm taking on, not wanting to do everything. And also became less scared of losing income because of that. So I'm just telling people no more often. And I've learned now that that's actually a catalyst for business. So you become more of a personality and more of an expert in a particular niche in the music industry. And that niche automatically fits you very well because you've created it, basically. And so that would be my advice. Don't try to do everything. Just do what feels best and really go for it.
Yeah, I feel like you can pretty quickly tell when something doesn't feel right. There's sessions that I've done that I was capable of doing, but it really felt terrible doing it, And then there are also things that I might not have thought I was going to do. Like it might be a style like, oh, that's not really the music I would listen to, but I really enjoyed recording it, and it surprises me.
I mean, I'm not saying that you should close yourself off from everything that you don't get, or no, I'd like to be challenged, but there's sometimes I've learned to trust my gut instinct a bit more when it comes to this. Like when people have certain expectations that I don't really see how that they will come to be in that setting or that way of working, I just stay clear and I think, okay, I don't get it probably. So find somebody else.
Also, Rockstars, if you get an email that starts with asking whether or not you accept credit cards and then continues to tell you that they're going to send a driver and they're bringing 3 artists and they're not going to be there and somebody's, father-in-law's in recovery somewhere or something like that, it's probably just a spam email and you can ignore that one anyway. That's a freebie for you. Right there.
Yeah, freebie that right there.
Awesome, dude. Well, thank you so much for being on the show again. Let the Rockstars know where can they go find out more about you. What if they're ready to make their next hit record with you? Let's say you can squeeze another song into those 863 in 2022.
Well, yeah, look me up by my name, Wessel Oltheten, or Wessel Oltheten in English accent. There's only one, I think, so you'll automatically find my website. And you can also find the book. There's also a site for that, mixingwithimpact.com. I'm also on Instagram. Same deal.
And worth checking out because it's a gorgeous studio. Just incredible. We didn't get to talk too much about that, but we will next time.
We will
Wessel,
next time.
thank you so much for being on the show with us. I look forward to seeing you in person. It's been a minute since I've been to the Netherlands, but I really enjoyed it when I was there.
Great. You're always welcome.
Thanks, man. Thanks for listening, Rockstars. We'll see you guys in the next episode. Cheers, man. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our awesome sponsors who help make this episode possible. OWC, Spectra 1964, JZ Microphones, Atom Audio, Solid State Logic, and Isotope. Remember to use these coupon codes for special discounts. At isotope.com/rockstars, use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off any plugin purchase, or start your extended 30-day free trial subscription for access to many plugins. At jzmic.com, use the code ROCKSTAR for 40% off the V47, V67, and V12 microphones. That's what you're hearing my voice on right now. At recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy, use the coupon ROCKSTAR for 10% off any course for a limited time. If you enjoyed Recording Studio Rockstars, then please check out our sponsors using the link in our show notes, because it's a great way to help support this show. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio, and they're going to help you make your best record ever. I would also like to thank our fantastic team here at Recording Studio Rockstars, Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, and John Richardson, for additional podcast and video production. Thanks so much for listening, Rockstars, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.